This session has the title Cosmology, and that's because it's mostly about origins, but ultimately it's about affirming the authority of the Word of God. Cosmology is defined as an explanation for everything, where we come from, what we're doing here, and ultimately what happens to us when it's all over. Over the years, over the centuries, there have been a number of different cosmologies, but only two of those have ever gained any sort of credibility. The first one is the biblical one, which has stood on its own for thousands of years, and the second one is the so-called scientific version, which has been in a state of development for the last 200 odd years. The two have nothing in common other than the fact that you and I are here now. And may I also say that both of them, to an untrained ear, sound pretty far-fetched. Let's summarize the two. The biblical version goes something like this. 6,000 odd years ago, a higher being, all-knowing and all-powerful, decided to create everything there is. And he did so by speaking it into existence over a period of 6 literal earth days. Now you may well ask, as a lot of people do, where do we get the 6,000 years from? And the answer to that is very simple. There are genealogies in the Bible which go something like Bill begat John when he was 45 years old, and John begat Jerry when he was 35. And using those genealogies, which go all the way back to Adam, and using those in combination with some known established historical events, we can calculate roughly how long ago Adam and Eve walked naked in the Garden of Eden. Then you may well ask, where do we get the 6 literal earth days from? Because the Hebrew word for day used there, yom, can mean two things. It can mean a literal earth day, a single rotation of the earth, or it can mean an age, as in the day of the dinosaurs means the age during which dinosaurs roamed the earth. And the answer to that is very simple. The author, whom we believe was Moses, went out of his way to make sure we would understand which meaning he intended. And so he said there was an evening and there was a morning, the first day. And then there was an evening and there was a morning, the second day. And there was an evening and a morning, the third day. Now there's no long age which only has one evening and one morning. Therefore it's ultimately clear that the author intended us to believe he was talking about a literal earth day. You could even ask, why did he put the evening first? And the answer to that is very simple. In the Hebrew calendar, every new day starts in the evening at 6 o'clock at night. But it doesn't stop there. As we turn the pages, we discover that this same higher being actually pre-planned our salvation before he even started creating. And that salvation would involve him coming to earth in human form some 4,000 years later and dying on a cross and then being resurrected 3 days later. And you will scratch your head. Why did he make it so complicated? Why didn't he just make us a little bit closer to perfect so we wouldn't need salvation in the first place? Or alternatively, why didn't he force himself to be a little bit more tolerant? After all, he made us the way we are. And as we turn the pages, we become aware that's a very good reason for this. Whilst our stint here on earth is of critical importance, ultimately it is about our eternal relationship with him. And that eternal relationship becomes so much more deep and meaningful and intimate and personal when it's done this way, where he has to sacrifice himself to save us. And we use our free will to decide to be with him above anything else. So if you find that a little bit far-fetched, wait till you hear the scientific version. It goes something like this. Something like 13.7 billion years ago, a point of nothing, located nowhere, exploded in a massive explosion called the Big Bang. And in that Big Bang, it spewed out all the material needed to build the universe that we see today. But at that point, it was mostly dust and gas. It goes on. In addition to all this material, it spewed out media within which all that material would exist. And that included space and time and light. And in addition to that, it spewed out rules for behavior of all this massive amount of material, like laws of physics and chemistry. Mankind is pretty smart, you know. So far we've identified 4 different forces that operate within the universe. The first one is electromagnetic force, which makes sure a light comes on when you flick a switch on the wall. And then there's the weak nuclear force, which generates background radiation. And then there's the strong nuclear force, which makes sure that mankind can now totally wipe itself out of existence if just a few idiots put their minds to it. And then the fourth force, science doesn't really understand yet. It's called gravity. We know an awful lot about what it does, but not what makes it work. Gravity causes bits of matter to be attracted to each other. So all this dust and gas that was spewed out in the Big Bang was being acted on by gravity. And gravity, the more bits of matter that cling together, the stronger becomes the gravitational pull. And gravitational pull can become so strong that it can bend space and time and light. And so the theory goes on that 4.5 billion years ago it was the turn of our solar system to pull itself together using gravity. At that point in time, the Earth was just a fiery ball. But give it another billion years and it will have cooled by an enormous amount to become a beautiful blue planet that we all know and love. It would be, had there been anyone around to call it that, habitable, because it had an atmosphere, it had a magnetic field, it had dry land and oceans, it had water. It was just the right distance away from the sun and had just the right rate of rotation to not freeze to death and not to fry to death. But it had no life. And so the scientific version continues on speculating that there were lakes on the dry land, chock-a-block with billions of chemicals, tiny little chemicals. And there was some sort of wooden spoon agitation of the contents of each lake, because if it was stagnant, nothing would ever happen. And then the time came when just the right amount of chemicals were just in the right place at exactly the right time by sheer accident to make the first single cell amoeba life form. And that life form could not only just move around, it could make copies of itself, because life isn't life until it can make copies of itself. But of course that's not enough. It doesn't stop there. The theory says that in due course, over millions of years of evolution, that single cell amoeba managed to turn itself by sheer accident into apples and oranges, into animals, all sorts, and eventually into athletes and acrobats and accountants. So which of these two are you going to believe? It's a pretty hard choice. Let's just summarize how the two compare, mostly spiritually. The biblical version says 6,000 years, and the scientific version says billions of years. The biblical version says everything was created to reproduce after its kind. And the scientific version basically says anything can turn itself into anything else given enough time. The biblical version says not only were we created in His image. Now there's a lot of debate about what that means, to be created in His image. Does it mean we look like Him? Does it mean we are creative like Him? I believe, and I don't have to be right in this, because other parts of the Bible confirm this. But I believe it means that we are triune in a similar way to the way He is triune. He is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And we are made body, soul, and spirit. The scientific version says, we were just a glorified bit of pond scum that got very, very lucky. The biblical version says, because we are made in His image, there's a very good chance that when this physical body is worn out, there is something left over to continue existing. Scientific version says, when a bunch of chemicals stop bouncing off each other, sorry mate, it's all over. The biblical version says, the things we do and say and the decisions we make while we're here on earth affect what happens to us in the hereafter. The scientific version says, oh, terribly sorry to have to tell you this, but there is no hereafter. The biblical version basically says, we are here, therefore there must be a God. The scientific version says, we are here and there is no God. Therefore everything must have just made itself. So which of the two are you going to choose to believe in? It's almost a no-brainer, isn't it? I mean, who would choose to believe in a version that says, a cosmology that says, life is totally meaningless. We're just the product of some incredibly freakish cosmic accident. There is no meaning or purpose, and there's no eternity to look forward to. When you could choose to believe that everything we do is meaningful and that we're here for a purpose, and there's a very good chance that life continues after death. I can't believe who would choose to believe in the meaningless one. But it's science, isn't it? It says it's science. So intimidated was the church in the last 150 odd years that it tried somehow to incorporate long ages into the creation account. We didn't want to look foolish in the eyes of the world. And so we came up with theistic evolution, which said basically that God created us, but He used evolution to do it. Mind you, the incredibly cruel method of evolution which causes all the weaker versions to die in order for the fittest to survive. And then we came up with the gap theory, which said that yes, God made us in 6 literal earth days, but those days were separated by enormous gaps of millions of years, which unfortunately weren't mentioned in the creation account. And then we came up with the day-age theory, which said that the word yom can mean a literal day or it can mean a long age. And obviously it meant a long age. But we had no idea what impact that would have on the rest of the Bible. So let's just have a look at that impact. We're assuming that the creation took place over millions of years. Adam, who was made on day 6 and would have rested with the Lord on the 7th. In those circumstances, he would have been millions of years old by the time he sinned. And I can see a lot of people will already realize what an enormous impact that will have on the very message of the gospel. In the circumstances, Adam could not have been a real person, nor could he have been guilty of the original sin. Millions of years means that the fossil record is a reflection of death, disease, and suffering. Millions of years before Adam was even thought of. And that means that death did not enter the world through one man's sin. And that sends the gospel message crumbling. We continue reading and we come to the genealogies, which work their way all the way back to Adam. But if Adam is a myth, the genealogies are a myth. And we start scratching our head. When does God start telling the truth? And we come to Exodus 20. Moses is coming down the mountain with 2 tablets under his arms. He's been up there talking to God for 40 days and 40 nights. He's learned all the information needed to fill the first 5 books of the Bible. And he has 2 tablets on which are inscribed the 10 Commandments, the foundation for moral behavior for the entire planet. And commandment number 4 says, to his chosen people, you shall observe, work for 6 days and rest on the 7th and keep it holy. Because that's what I, your Creator God, did when he made everything. 6 days and 1 day of rest. Is God lying? Think about it. Or is God telling his people to work for 6 million years and then rest for 1 million? Obviously not. And as we continue reading the Bible, we turn the pages and we come across something like 200 prophecies about a coming Messiah who will set right the repercussions of the disobedience of one man, the first Adam. And we realize that if the first Adam was a myth, the coming Messiah will be impotent to correct his mistake. And then we come to the New Testament, and Jesus arrives in spectacular fashion with choirs of angels heralding his arrival. And as we turn the pages, we realize not only is Jesus the prophesied Messiah and fulfills all the prophecies made about his coming, but he also is the Creator. He was there. And then shock horror. As we read on, we discover that Jesus believes in six-day creation. Literal six-day creation. He quotes Moses numerous times. He tells his scoffers, "You wouldn't believe what Moses told you, and he wrote about me." How on earth are you ever going to believe what I'm telling you? This is Jesus, the man we are following. The person who's given us our name as Christians. And we realize if we build long ages into the creation account, the entire Bible turns into a myth. No more meaningful than the Greek mythology or the Roman mythology or the Norse mythology. And we were left standing with nothing. So are you ready to make up your mind? Science. They've told us, the scientific people have told us, it's science. How can we argue with a scientist who holds up a stone in his hand and says this stone is 1,000,000 years old and I can prove it? How can we argue and say, no, it can't be more than 6,000 years old? So I think it's high time that we investigate just how scientific the scientific version is. And to do that, first we go to Google and we look up the word science. And we find out that it's based on the word scientia in Latin, meaning knowledge. And then we look for a definition of the word science. And we find out that there are numerous definitions of the word science. And I was looking for one that was pretty specific and one even I could understand. And I found one. And I thought, yes, that's the one we need. And that science definition said, science is anything that can be shown to be true repeatedly under controlled conditions. I'll repeat that. Science is anything that can be shown to be true repeatedly under controlled conditions. So there are three elements that are necessary for something to be science. You have to be able to demonstrate it, show it. Once is not enough. You have to be able to show it repeatedly. And you must be able to control the conditions under which the experiment is done so that the conditions are always the same each time. There are three aspects of the scientific cosmology without which it absolutely has no legs to stand on. And those three things are the Big Bang Theory, the lifeless chemicals turning into life theory, and the theory of evolution. You must remember that there is such a thing as scientific theory, but that doesn't become science until it's proven and has satisfied those elements that I just called out. So we come here to the Big Bang Theory. Do you know what it's based on? It's based on the color red. When a scientist looks at the night sky through a telescope, anything that is traveling towards him will take on a bluish tinge. And the reason for that is that the light waves traveling from the object to the viewer are shortened or compacted by the direction of travel. They call that a blue shift. Anything traveling away from the viewer takes on a red shift. And that's because the light waves traveling from the object to the viewer are stretched out by the direction of travel. And it just so happens that the great bulk of things out there take on a red shift. And that means that all these objects are traveling away from us. All very scientific. You can demonstrate it. You can get any novice to look through the telescope and see the same thing. You can do it night after night after night, so it can be repeated. And the only conditions that you have to control is make sure that the night sky is not clouded over. But from here, it becomes circular reasoning. They say because there was a Big Bang, the universe is limited. It has an outer boundary beyond which there is nothing, not even space, not even light, not even anything. And that means, because everything's traveling away from us, that the universe must be expanding. And the next conclusion is that because the universe is expanding, yesterday it must have been a little bit smaller than it is today. And by the same token, 100 years ago, the universe was substantially smaller than it is today. And 1,000 years ago, it would have been very substantially smaller than it is today. And therefore, 1 billion years ago, it was massively smaller than it is today. And therefore, 13.7 billion years ago, it was so small, it didn't exist, and therefore there had to be a Big Bang. So we can summarize this by saying, because there was a Big Bang, there had to be a Big Bang. Is it science? No, it's not science. It can't be demonstrated. Scientific people have made numerous attempts to generate a mini bang or even a micro bang and haven't succeeded. And if you can't do it once, it certainly can't repeat it. So it's not science. It's theory made by people who don't want to acknowledge a creator. So let's go to the next one. Turning lifeless chemicals into life. Now, that one is so far-fetched that most scientists, the bulk of scientists, would acknowledge that, hey, the origin of life has not yet got an answer. Science can't explain it. But for the cosmology to have a basis, they have to have an explanation of some sort, just to have a continuous narrative. And so what they suggest is that these little lakes had chemicals come in the right place at the right time to generate the first amoeba. First of all, the pond would have to generate a whole lot of amino acids, which are the building block of life. There are something like 200 chemically different amino acids, of which only 20 are suitable for generating life. On top of that, each one of those amino acids has a mirror image version. And so basically 20 out of 400 amino acids are suitable for generating life. Because the ones suitable for life all have to be the same handedness, they call it. And so you would need in the pond some sort of sorting mechanism that takes away all the amino acids unsuitable for life and sets aside massive numbers of amino acids that are suitable for life. And that requires intelligence. And then you have to have some sort of formula to generate out of those amino acids proteins, because proteins are needed to make life. To give you some idea of how many proteins it takes to make a human being, we're looking at 100,000 different proteins. To generate the simplest form of life, you need several thousand proteins, especially to make sure that it had a duplicating mechanism in it. And so if that is so, there has to be a formula somewhere that controls the duplication and the turning of amino acids into proteins. And then we find out that most of those proteins are water soluble. And so once it's made one protein and starts working on the next one, the other one is already dissolving. So no, and even if you could somehow get all these thousands of proteins made at exactly the same time, and there has to be a blueprint on how to put them together into a life form. You can't just put one there and one there. They have to be in the right place. Again, that calls for intelligence. It's absolutely impossible. So you may well ask, is it science? Well, the answer is no, it's not science. Lots of people have tried to make life in a test tube and nobody succeeded or even come close. And now we come to the next one, which is now becoming so popular. It's being rammed down the throats of our children. Where they go to school, every lesson practically talks about evolution and something has evolved. Every documentary, every nature program, every zoo, every museum, every textbook talks about evolution as if it was a scientific fact, and our children are being told it is scientific fact. We evolved. How on earth are our children ever going to believe what the Bible tells them? Well, let me tell you, when Darwin first came up and published his novel, The Origin of Species, yes, you're allowed to laugh at that, he was speaking and writing in total ignorance. At that point in time, in the 1850s, the state of the art in microscopes could just barely see the outer skin of a living cell. And so they all assumed that the inside of a living cell was a blob of jelly. It wasn't till nearly 100 years later, the early 1950s, when Francis Crick and his mate James Watson discovered the DNA molecule, thanks to the invention of the electron microscope some 20 years earlier. It was probably the biggest breakthrough, scientific breakthrough ever. Not only had they discovered a new molecule, they had discovered the secret to life on Earth. DNA, everything on this planet that lives runs on DNA. All the way from a single cell amoeba to a blade of grass, to a tree, to an animal, to a very intelligent professor. Everything depends on DNA. Let me give you some idea of how much DNA is involved in a making of a human being. I already said that there are 100,000 different proteins, but a human being is made up of 30 trillion living cells. And each of those living cells has within it DNA holding information on how to build another human being just like it, equivalent to 3 Encyclopedias Britannica, all 30 volumes of it 3 times over in each of those cells. So we're walking around, well, I've lost a lot of, so I'm probably walking around with a few less, but the average person is walking around with 90 trillion Encyclopedias Britannicas. There are scientific rules and laws and principles that counter evolution. In biology, there's a rule that says information can only be the product of intelligence. The second law of thermodynamics says that everything left alone in nature will gradually deteriorate and degenerate until it's no longer functional. It's also known as the law of entropy. A lot of you kids will have heard of it in school. And here comes the evolutionists, and they say, oh no, you leave things alone in nature and they will get better. The weaker ones will die off and the better ones will survive. Survival of the fittest. Science of mathematics says it's impossible. The chances of life evolving are so incredibly remote, it's not possible. What they discovered was not only the secret of life on Earth, they discovered evidence, undeniable evidence of creation. DNA could not be there without creation. The chances of it coming about by sheer fluke of nature is not tenable. And so here we are. By all rights, in the 1950s, the entire scientific population of the earth should have fallen down on their hands and knees and worshipped the divine creator. But did they? They had 100 years to get used to being able to explain life on earth without a creator. And they weren't going to give up. But for a couple of years, they must have been running around like chooks with their heads cut off. And then finally they came up. Ha! An explanation. They needed an explanation when it first came out to say, here is a mechanism that generates spontaneously new, meaningful DNA. And there was no such mechanism. And so now they said that mechanism is the accumulation of copying errors made during the reproductive process. Every time a cell makes a copy of itself, there's the chance of a mistake being made. And so when you accumulate those mistakes, by sheer accident, one of them will be a meaningful change that will improve the life form. Absolutely absurd. So you may well ask, is it science? And the answer is no, it's not science. Nobody can demonstrate the spontaneous generation of new, meaningful DNA. The favourite example evolutionists use is the development of superbugs that are resistant to antibiotics. And this is given as an example of evolution in progress. But the truth is that those bugs develop immunity or resistance to antibiotics by losing DNA, not by gaining it. And there you have it. The entire scientific cosmology is science under false pretenses. But that's what's now being fed to our children as the explanation for the diversity of life on planet Earth, putting at risk their salvation without any qualms or conscience. Which one are you going to believe? Well, I can tell you now. Paul said it in 1 Romans 20. The evidence of a divine creator is in everything that is made. You would be excused for thinking that Paul had had a revelation and knew about the DNA molecule. So yes, that rock really is less than 6,000 years old. And yes, we have been created. And yes, we have a creator who loves us and wants to spend eternity with us. But it's going to be on his terms, not on ours. And so I encourage you, choose him above anything else. And then praise his glorious name, the name of Jesus, for his love and for his mind-boggling ingenuity in how he designed us. Thank you.